Quick question. Will you be my...
I can't stop the loneliness こらえきれず悲しみが止まらない
If you watch my channel for a while now, you'd realize that the majority of the videos I make mostly consist of US, German, and Czechoslovakian tanks, with the USSR getting a mention here and there. Because of this, I often get comments saying that I don't talk about British tanks enough, which, to be fair, is true, as they often don't correlate with the pacing of the video. But, since it's the month of the Valentine, I thought it would be fitting to talk about Britain's most produced tank of the war, that being the Mk.III infantry tank Valentine. The Valentine had over 8,000 units produced, serving from late 1940 all the way to the end of the war and served on multiple fronts. But you probably already knew that.
All my friends know the low rider.
This might take a while, so if you want to skip this part, go to this timestamp, where I finally talk about the Valentine, that's what I wanted to say. Fuck! In 1936, the British War Office wanted two kinds of tanks in its arsenal. Infantry tanks that would have a ludicrous amount of armor and support infantry, and cruiser tanks, which were meant to exploit breakthroughs and harass the enemy from their flanks. At the time, the only tanks the British had in service were the medium Mk.II and only 3 medium Mk.IIIs, with the production of Mk.IIIs being cancelled due to Britain being that one friend that never has money with him whenever you guys go out together. 2 years prior to this dilemma, Sir John Kardashian from Vickers Armstrong was asked if he could make a tank that won't put a strain on the British war economy, thus burning the anomaly known as the Mk.I cruiser, also known as the A9. But the A designations are more of a set of requirements rather than an actual tank designation. In 1936, when a pilot model was finally made and given the designation A9E1, the Mk.I incorporated almost all the modern features found on the Mk.III medium, but due to the big SAD, a lot of these features had to be shortcutted, which led to the Mk.I lacking in some areas. The suspension, whilst excellent for an interwar design, couldn't compete with the effectiveness and popularity of the Christie suspension, which the British War Office started to take a keen interest in, and so the Mk.I cruiser was mostly used as an interim until the Mk.IV cruiser design was finalized. The Mk.I was fitted with a 2-pounder gun and a Vickers machine gun housed in the main turret, with 2 more Vickers machine guns housed in 2 separate turrets, or sub-turrets, in the front. Once again, going back to 1934, the British War Office requested another set of requirements for the cruiser tank program. These set of requirements would be designated A10 and consisted of increasing the frontal armor from 14 to 25mm and getting rid of the silly machine gun turrets in the front. However, the extra weight of the increased armor meant that the tank's top speed was decreased from 40 km an hour all the way down to 26 km an hour, but this speed was deemed acceptable by the British War Office. The Mk.II was armed with the same 2-pounder and Vickers machine gun in the turret, but also had a Besa machine gun mounted in the hull, which is a British copy of the Czechoslovak ZB-53. In 1936, a few months after the Mk.I's first appearance, the first prototype of the Mk.II was complete. However, the lead designer of the program, John Carden, tragically died in a plane crash, significantly slowing down development until the year 1937, where it was accepted into service as a heavy cruiser tank. In total, 175 units were produced, 45 being produced by Metropolitan Camel, another 45 being produced by Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, and 10 by Vickers. In late 1939, the British War Office would go on to order 75 more from Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. A notable variant of the Mk.II is the Mk.II ACS, which instead of the 2-pounder housed a 91mm howitzer. The Mk.II saw combat with the British Expeditionary Force in 1940 France, and also during the Battle of Tobruk in North Africa.
Home Guard will keep them on the run until the war is won. We'll keep watching every
In 1935, Sir Hughes LS, who was the Master General of Ordnance, and Major General Davidson sat down for brekkie and had a little chit-chat. Besides the heightening global tensions, the world going through a large unhappiness, and a brief discussion about the importance of Churchill's cigar ration, the main focus of the chit-chat was the need for a cheap infantry support tank. And so, after brekkie, they go over to Major General Percy Hobart's house and consult him about the creation of an infantry tank. Hobart gives it the thumbs up, and development of the A11 began. However, due to the ever-increasing budget of Churchill's cigar ration, the A11 had to be cheap. Extremely cheap. So, during development, the main idea was, let's just slap on an ungodly amount of armor on it, give it a machine gun instead of a cannon, because cannons are expensive, and put the cheapest engine we can find into the hull. Simultaneously, development of the A12 has also begun, but due to Britain still being trapped in the colossal sorrow, priority was given to the A11. When the set of requirements was laid out, our homeboy John Carden got to work on the design, as I like to call it, the anomaly. The tank was armed with a Vickers machine gun housed in a fully rotating turret, and its frontal armor consisted of 60mm. Keep in mind that at the time, most tanks had 14 to 25mm of frontal armor, so putting 60mm of armor at the time was almost unheard of. Due to the tank needing to be as cheap as possible, coupled with the ungodly amount of armor, the Matilda was fitted with a Ford V8 Model 79, which was a good engine if you wanted to put it into a car, but literally almost unusable if you wanted to put it into something 10 times heavier. It's due to this that the Matilda had a whopping top speed of 12 kilometers per hour. On road. British engineering at its finest, everyone. The Matilda got to see combat during one battle in France, where despite it being literally worse than anything the French had, and trust me, that is a low, low bar, it still found relative success during the battle. In total, 140 units were made, with each unit costing around £5,000. If you guys remember correctly, I mentioned an A12. Well, after development of the A11 finished, the A12 program could finally get the funding it needed. However, due to Carden's tragic death, the only contender for the A12 program was Vulcan Foundry, which made the Valentine II. The British liked the design, and since there were no other contenders, the Matilda II was accepted into service, and production began. However, once again going back to Carden's unexpected death, the spot for lead designer was now left open, and the person who took that spot was none other than Leslie Little. Previously overshadowed by his predecessor, this was his chance to shine, and oh boy, shine he did. After the company he worked for, that being Carden Lloyd, got absorbed by Vickers Armstrong, Little was once again promoted from lead engineer to chief of tank development. Now, Little knew that his design for a new infantry tank would have had to be compared to the Matilda II, but he also knew another thing, that the Matilda II was too heavy, big, hard to produce, and most importantly, expensive. So, Little got to work on an infantry tank that wasn't overly expensive, and he ended up making just that. When the British War Office had a propaganda at the design, they initially rejected it. However, due to tensions rising in Europe, the British War Office needed a new tank, and most importantly, a cheaper design, fast. In order to make the tank cheaper, Little made the difficult decision to gut the third man in the turret, and instead opt for a two-man turret layout, which cut down on internal space needed, thus allowing the tank to have a smaller turret ring, allowing the hull to be more narrow, making production easier, meaning it was much cheaper. Yada yada, you get the gist. Where the majority of the design elements meant to cut costs were in production, and the ability to use off-the-shelf components, which, as previously mentioned, was practically unheard of as standardization was basically a dead language when it came to early war British tank designs. But just because Little's design was an easy-to-produce tank, that doesn't mean it was immune to British quirkiness. For example, the escape hatches for the driver. Seriously, Britain, what the fuck? But, because the British War Office was desperate for a new, cheap, and easier-produced design, Little's design was accepted into service under the designation Mk.III infantry tank, also known as the Valentine, which, funnily enough, no one really knows where it came from. Yes, there are some theories, like the design was given to the British War Office around Valentine's Day, i.e. February 10th, another one saying it was a tribute to our boy John Carden, whose middle name was Valentine. However, another theory, which seems to be more plausible, that being an acronym for Vickers Armstrong Limited Elswick Newcastle upon Tyne.
Hole in the back and have it stick out the back. The engine's no good. Get 5 car engines and put them together.
Looking at the design, the Valentine looks pretty old school, with the majority of the components already being used in previous tanks. However, the Valentine, as previously mentioned, was different. The suspension is the same one used on the Mark I and Mark II cruiser tanks. The hull was basically a heavily modified and up-armored cruiser Mark I/II hull, and the gun manlet uses a multitude of components from the Matilda II. In terms of reliability, it was extremely reliable. The hull was riveted, as most British tank manufacturers at the time were or used to be locomotive factories. The factories that did know how to weld were used to produce aircraft and warships, as those took priority. If you look at most early war British tanks, you'd see that most of them are riveted, which, as mentioned, was a product of locomotive manufacturing, with the Matilda II being the exception, as that had a cast hull. However, later in the war, once a significant number of factory workers learned how to weld, most of the British tanks would be welded, and this includes the Valentine, which leads us to our next segment, and the reason why you're probably here. Our journey starts with the infantry tank Mk.III Valentine Mark I. Yes, this is the full designation, but from here on out, I'll probably just be calling it Valentine Mark I, Mark II, and so on, as saying infantry tank Mk.III Valentine Mark 69 over and over again isn't as orgasmically pleasing as saying M48376W HVSS. Not to mention the British Mark designations, because as the Britain we're talking about after all, tend to jump around from here and there, where, unlike US designations, where the evolution of the designations tends to correlate with the model's evolution. Well, almost correlate, but you get the point. Anyway, the Mark I is the basic bitch of the Valentine family, with a 2-pounder gun, a coaxial MG, and powered by a 135 horsepower A189 gasoline engine. Its only identifiable feature, externally speaking, is the engine exhaust on the side, as opposed to the rest. This one is much more simple. After the Valentine Mark I, production on a new Valentine tank has commenced, with the Mark II improving on the main power plant. The power plant was improved by replacing the old gasoline engine with a newer 131 horsepower A90 diesel engine. Now, autistic nerd, you might be asking. If the old engine has 135 horsepower and the new one has 131 horsepower, how could it be better? Well, my dear viewer, that is a good question. You see, aside from reliability, there are other factors that makes an engine better. If you only compare engine efficiency based on horsepower, that would be like only comparing tanks based off hard factors. The real answer ain't that simple. Another factor to consider is torque. Now, what is torque? Well, I don't fucking know what it is, but I kinda know what it does mean, so, you're gonna get the best explanation I can give you. So what larger torque allows you to do is to accelerate quicker and retain your top speed even after turning, which is why despite the Matilda II and Valentine having the exact same top speed, the Valentine was much more mobile as it could easily accelerate to and retain that top speed, whereas the Matilda II could not. Not to mention diesel engines tend to have more torque than gasoline engines. The Mark II also came with genocidal canisters like on the Crusader or Matilda in order to increase its operational range. One of the biggest gripes the British War Office had on the Valentine was the fact that it only had a 2-man turret, instead of the preferred 2-man turret plus Nigel. However, in its current configuration, Nigel couldn't fit in the tank without having to be inside one of his crewmates. Yeah, sure, it might seem comfortable for Nigel at first, in fact he might actually enjoy it. However, being forced to be inside someone kinda takes the fun out of it, and so the Mark III was created. The Mark III is very distinct from its predecessors, mostly due to its Warhammer 40k looking mantlet. This mantlet allowed the gun breech to sit further front as opposed to the old legacy mantlet. This allowed Nigel to comfortably sit inside the turret without him having to stick his meat rod up Roger's ballsack.
I'm going to turn into a truck now. Back it up, pack it in. Let me begin.
Moving forward, the Mark IV takes a step back in one area by retaining the legacy mantlet, but also takes a step forward in another, that being the engine, replacing the A90 diesel with American General Motors 6004 diesel, and replacing the transmission for an American one. The American engine didn't have the same mileage as the British one, but it made up for it in that the engine and the transmission was much quieter and, more importantly, reliable. For The Mk.V is basically a Mk.III, but with the American engine and transmission, and just like with the Mk.II, it had a jettisonable fuel tank. If any of you watched my first video, you'd know that Britain for a long time was trying to get the US to make British tanks. This ultimately failed. However, they did have one ace up their sleeve, or if you really can call it a sleeve. Wait, what? What?
I am having an aneurysm.
The Mk.VI were Canadian-produced Mk.IVs, and fun fact, the first 15 had a Besa heavy machine gun, with the rest being fitted with a US 30 cal machine gun. The Mk.VII is exactly like the Mk.VI. However, they installed a better radio in the turret, resulting in the bustle being dummy thick, making it an identifiable feature. Later on in the war, the British War Office realized that their 2-pounder guns don't provide an oomph. So, it was decided to mount the 57mm 6-pounder anti-tank gun into a heavily modified Mk.III turret with a newly designed mantlet. However, this came at a cost. Nigel. You see, due to how massive the 6-pounder gun was compared to the 2-pounder, Nigel once again found himself inside one of his fellow crewmates, so Nigel decided to opt out and leave. Also, by this time, the Valentine was starting to be used as a cruiser tank, rather than a dedicated infantry tank. The Mk.X machine gun had to be gutted as the mantlet wasn't designed to house one. This would have become the Mk.VIII. However, funnily enough, the Mk.VIII was never produced, but hypothetically, if it were to be produced, it would be a Mk.III with a modified turret, no Mk.X machine gun, and a 6-pounder gun. The Valentine Mk.IX is exactly like the Mk.VIII, except for 2 differences. 1, it actually entered production, and 2, the engine was the American General Motors 6004. It's actually because of the engine that the Mk.VIII was never produced, making this the first Valentine with a 6-pounder. And just like the Mk.VIII, the Mk.IX does not have a Mk.X machine gun.
You say it's too late to make it, but is it too late to try? And all that time that you wasted, all of my bridges burned down. I wasted my nights, you turned out the lights, now I'm paralyzed.
The Mk.X fixes one major flaw of the previous variant, that being the absence of the Mk.X machine gun. This was done by slightly changing the mantlet in order for it to incorporate the Mk.X, which is the main identifiable feature of the... I cannot fucking speak! Fuck! And now we get to our final variant. But what could the Mk.XI do what the Mk.X couldn't? Well, let me tell you, as there are in fact 2 more improvements, one of which is once again the main gun, and the other is in the armor. If you remember from the startish of the video, I mentioned that most Valentines at first were riveted, and later welded. Well, this variant is the later. The Mk.XI is the only variant to have a welded hull. Not only did the welded hull make the Valentine lighter, emphasizing its new role as a cruiser, but it also increased production, and decreased crew fatalities, as when hit, it didn't have rivets inside to give the crew inside a not so pleasant day. Another thing the Mk.XI changed is the aforementioned new gun, upgrading from the 6-pounder to a 75mm. The reason for this was utility, as yes, the 6-pounder was an excellent anti-tank gun, however, it absolutely sucked when it came to fighting infantry and fortifications, which was the majority of encounters the British faced on the Western Front. It's often well known that 19 out of 20 encounters were against infantry. Funnily enough, the ordnance QF 75mm were just bored out 57mm in order to fire the US 75mm rounds. So yeah, they went from an excellent anti-tank gun that did jack shit when it came to firing high explosive, to a decent anti-tank gun that arguably has the best high explosive round in ratio to its size. So in terms of what they were facing, it was a huge step up. All in all, the 75mm gun and the welded armor are the tank's identifiable features. So yeah, that's practically it when it comes to the Valentine's base variants. I did have an entire section dedicated to Soviet Valentines and how the Soviets got Valentines from Britain via Lend-Lease, and talking about how, because of the Soviets loving it so much, that the British kept on producing them because of that. But because I had a very limited amount of time and me needing to get this video out before Valentine's Day, I said, you know what, I'll just leave it out and maybe lay it off for a later video sometime this year. I have no idea, because I have an entire roadmap of videos I want to make, and I'm not sure if it'll even fit into this year. So, yeah, see you all in 2 months. Oh, and if you want to know what my opinion is on the Valentine, then it's very similar to the M3 Lees. It's not that it was necessarily good, nor necessarily bad, but rather it was needed. So in the end, that's kind of all that matters.